This is Avery Bishop, author of The Girls in the Dark, and this is One Final Twist.
So we'll just jump right in. We actually met at BoucherCon in Nashville in 2024, I believe. I met you when they were doing the author bonanza. Um, and I,
Oh, that's right. I
yep.
remember.
And I had actually listened to your Robert Swartwood audiobook that was just coming out on the way down to Nashville. So I was excited to
Oh,
get the chance to meet you after just listening to your book. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and then the fact that you write under multiple names?
yeah. So I would say I am one of those writers who has always wanted to be a writer for the longest time. Like I remember, I think in middle school, or maybe even I'm trying to remember when I first started writing things. Probably dabbling stuff, being creative in elementary, but in middle school is when I really started. uh, Starting short stories. I mean, I was in sixth grade when Jurassic Park came out, the movie Jurassic Park. And so that was huge. And then from that,
Mhm.
I started reading a lot of Michael Crichton. Started everything that Michael Crichton had read. And then from then Michael Crichton, I started reading Stephen King. And my very first Stephen King novel was Insomnia. I remember being in eighth grade. I was visiting my grandmother in upstate New York, and I was, I think, in her front yard, like just sitting outside under a tree. And when I finished that book, and that was my very first Stephen King book. And for people who have read Insomnia, it's probably not the best introduction to Stephen King, but I really loved it. I was blown away. And I remember finishing that and just thinking to myself, like, this is what I want to do. I want to be a novelist, a storyteller. And from there, just really started. And that's why a lot of my earlier stuff was more supernatural horror, because I felt like, okay, I want to be a writer like Stephen King. I'm going to write a lot of that stuff. But even even writing that type of genre stuff, it felt like a lot of my work was leaning more towards thriller, very fast paced, crime, and it's eventually that's just what I ended up embracing. So I don't think I really write anything that's horror or quote unquote genre anymore, unless it's like, a friend is putting together an anthology or like for whatever reason specifically. But usually just a lot of my ideas or the stories I want to tell or the characters that um, inhibit those stories are more of the crime, mystery, thriller genre.
So you said you started writing at a young age. Did is that like in high school, middle school? When did you start writing?
Yeah, I would say I probably wrote some short stories, or I think I had tried writing what was supposed to be a novel, but was maybe more of like a novella length thing when I was either in eighth grade or ninth grade. But around that time was when I really started taking it seriously. I I think I was in high school when I had my very first short story published. I mean, but it was nothing
Wow.
like no like major magazine or anything. It was one of those, because I think like Ray Bradbury had like his very first story published in Weird Tales or something like that. Like it was nothing like along those lines, but it was still neat that
Yeah.
still being able to say, oh, I published something. I actually published something. And then me and a few friends had created kind of, we were very small, like private Christian school that we had gone to. So we didn't have like a school newspaper. So we created our own kind of zine that the administration let us do for a certain amount of time until some of the other staff on hand didn't like it and then finally got it yanked. But that was fun, just putting stuff out like that. I remember doing like a serialized short story called Thrasher, which was like, I think it came out like four parts. It was kind of like a murder mystery type thing. So yeah, there
Okay.
was a lot of things that I was doing around that time. In fact, I had even wanted to initially just write a novel. And I remember my parents at the time just saying, you should start slower. Why don't you do some short stories and work your way up? Which I guess was good advice. I've spoken to other writers who just right out of the gate have just written a novel, and
Hmm.
I guess it's worked for them. I mean, that's the thing. It's everybody has their own, I guess you would say, journey they're able to. And so, yeah, it was just a lot of short stories starting out, working up to novels. And at this point, quite honestly, as much as I would love to get back into writing short stories, my ideas almost seem a little bit too large to just do 10, 15 pages.
Hmm.
It just seems like, okay, at the very least, it's probably going to be like a very long novella, or it's going to be, a 300-page novel.
So I read somewhere in my research that you coined the term hint fiction.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So this was so at some point I think I had resisted social media for the longest time, which honestly I think and I'm old enough that there wasn't really social media at a certain point. I don't think kids these days really understand that there was a time like a BC
Right.
before social
Hmm.
media where there was Facebook and Twitter, which again I always still call it Twitter. I refuse to call it the other name. But so when that stuff started off, I really had no interest. I was really resistant, and even with a website. But eventually, I created a blog, and I knew that I needed to make people aware that it existed. And so I got into writing flash fiction. So again, going with the short stories, more flash fiction, which is usually like a thousand words or less. And because a lot of these online magazines were online, and so they would always link to your website or link to your blog. And I
Hmm.
figured, okay, well, this was a good way to kind of like build up some type of your name, making people aware that you even exist,
Yeah.
whatever else. Because I always feel like that's when I talk to newer writers, especially like the biggest struggle writers have, and probably the biggest struggle writers have always had is just like the threat of obscurity, the fact that there's just so many writers, so many books, so many stories out there. Making readers even aware that you exist is a huge struggle, let alone then having them pick up your book and reading it and liking it and everything else. So it's just, making people aware that you even exist. And so, yeah, I was doing a lot of flash fiction, and there was this one website called Everyday Fiction, which every day they publish a little flash fiction piece. And they had created kind of this spin-off, I forget, was it Flash Fiction Chronicles? Oh man, it's been so long now, I can't even remember. But what happened was, they were doing kind of more nonfiction, like it was like essays about writing and whatever else. And around that time, I had seen another writer post something on their website where they were basically, and I think they were being serious, but and I thought it was kind of ridiculous, but they said like, do you know in a movie when there's this character and blah blah blah, I don't think there's a name for that, so I'm going to name it. And so if everyone ever comes back, they can say like, oh, I'm the one that like did this, like, like basically like that's where it was like born or whatever. And so I had come up with this idea of, and I had written an essay called Hint Fiction when Flash Fiction becomes too flashy, I think it was called. And the whole
Okay.
idea was talking about how short can you make a story until it's no longer considered a story, really playing off the Hemingway six-word story, for sale, baby shoes never worn. And so, there's a lot of discussion on is that even a story? Well, if there's 100-word story or if there's 1,000-word story, and so like, and then I was like, these little short stories, they should be called hint fiction because they hint at a larger story. Again, very kind of like a tongue-in-cheek, like I'm going to
Hmm.
create this little literary term. Like I feel like had I sat down and seriously decided, okay, I want to create a literary term, nothing would have happened. But because the way things happen, it was kind of a joke initially. And I decided again for my website, for my blog, I wanted to get traffic. And so I said, I'm going to have a hint fiction contest. People can submit stories of 20, and I had said, how long should a hint fiction story be? And completely arbitrary, I was like 25 words or fewer. And so I had a contest at my website, and a literary author friend that I knew, Stuart Onan, who actually one of his books is being turned into a movie that's coming out, I think, somewhat soon, called a Prayer for the Dying, which is a really great novel. He had agreed to be the final judge because I had pitched it to him where I'll basically wean these down to like maybe like 20 stories, and then you
Hmm.
can so like you're going to be reading hardly anything because they're all like at least 25 words or fewer.
Right.
And his involvement Back in the day, there had been some like online literary trade magazines. One place called Galley Cat, which did a lot of like publishing news, and they had picked up the story somehow. I didn't forget why. I think it was maybe on someone else's blog, and just the way the internet kind of works. And they had picked up that pseudonym judges hint fiction contest, and they linked to my website. And all
Hmm.
of a sudden, of course, I look at my analytics and huge spike in traffic. And I think that same day, with an influx of just these submissions of people just writing these stories and submitting these stories, um, an editor at W. Norton had emailed me and copied my agent and said, I really love this idea. We should talk about putting together like an anthology of these stories. And then that's how my very first really major published thing ended up being an editor of this anthology of a literary term that I created as a joke, and then ended up, I was on NPR being interviewed. It was like being reviewed in the New Yorker. It did really well, and I think it's still out there. I will still get emails from like teachers and professors who will use it in their writing classes and stuff. Now, not nearly as much as I would like, but I still do get emails of people who will, say that they have it like it's they're still using it, and they find it helpful when, in terms of like teaching writing.
That is a crazy story to start with a basically a really small idea and then it just kind of blows up. But yeah, but like you said, that's kind of the way the internet works sometimes. It's you never know what people are going to grab onto and just take and make a whole new adventure out of it.
Yeah, I feel like had I gone to my agent with this idea and said I want to shop around this idea of doing it, like just there just no, it never would have happened. It's just one of those things, just the way things just line up, and sometimes a lot of you just really cannot prepare or anticipate certain things that just happen.
So your next Avery Bishop book is coming out on April 24th. So that's next week. Um, Tell us
And I
about
got
the
and
book.
I got copies here. They just came in just recently. In fact, I think you're
Nice.
on the list.
Yeah.
I'll be sending you one as waiting on a few other things, but they should hopefully be going out relatively soon.
Yeah, and I love the cover. It is just so eye-catching. I'm a person who unfortunately will judge a book by its cover, at least initially, because the cover is the first thing you see. And if a cover grabs my attention, then I'll want to pick up the book and look at it some more. And I don't know who designed the cover. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but whoever did really nailed it on this one. I love it. So can you tell us about the book?
So the Girls in the Dark, and I know, and we'll probably go back a little bit, talk about maybe the origins of where the pen name Avery Bishop comes from. But I will say that for the longest time, I was very resistant to dual timeline narratives. I don't know why, because I just felt like it was such a trend. Now I feel like it's kind of gone beyond trend. It's kind of become inherited in terms of the genre itself. It's like a lot of these books are just, it's always going to be, we're bouncing around in time. So my very first Avery Bishop novel, Girl Gone Mad, there are flashbacks, but those are usually interspersed throughout the main narrative. And then my second Avery Bishop book, One Year Gone, I actually did like a, a tri a tri-dual timeline where I had like three different timelines running concurrently throughout the entire book. Um, and then I think my Audible original, which came out last year, which will be out in paperback and ebook later this year, like that was a very just, now before chapters. And so the
Hmm.
same thing here with Girls in the Dark. We have a present day story, and then we also have a past story, a flashback story. But it centers around two sisters who in high school get abducted by a serial killer the same day. They're kept away for I think a little over 5 months. One manages to escape. She comes home before the authorities can get to where she was being kept. Her sister's no longer there. The killer's no longer there. They've vanished. Flash forward 20 years. At that point, she kind of has become a survivor's advocate, is given talks. She has written a book about her, detailing what had happened to her because, the serial killer, she managed to survive a serial killer. It became a really big book. I like to use the examples of just like A Million Little Pieces by James Frey and like Educated by Tara Westover. These really big memoir type books.
Hmm.
But in each instance, and with James Frey, it was a little bit more so. There's always, where's that line between, fact and fiction? At what point? And for those two books, there were other people who could either, you know, um, could like basically come and say, well, this isn't really accurate with you. In the instance here, our main character, Megan, the only people who can dispute anything that took place was one, the killer, and two, her sister, who after all of these years, 2 decades, she's believed is dead. So there's
Hmm.
nobody. So basically, she has this, and then we find out that really her story maybe wasn't 100% accurate. And so 20th year anniversary comes out. She's, and as is the case, some really crazy stuff starts happening, and it becomes kind of a mystery. And then she starts wondering, like, was her sister back? And if she is, why hasn't she like announced herself? And then, because
Hmm.
again, Megan is holding this secret, which she realizes if it gets out is really just going to like ruin her, quote unquote career, but also her, potentially her life. And so
Hmm.
she's really invested in keeping this. And then we also have other characters. We have an actress producer who's putting together a documentary. Her name is Serafina Bell, which actually she was not even really a character in my novella, my Audible original novella, Dear Serafina. She kind of like is she's the one that a character is writing to in Dear Serafina, but we never really actually see her. But I ended up using her. I actually used some characters from the chateau. So I kind of going like the Stephen King thing. I kind of have like my own little Avery verse where I kind of have characters who might kind of pop in and here and there. In fact,
Hmm.
I was actually just talking to someone the other day. My most recent Robert Swartwood novel, Enemy of the State, there is some crossover between that and Girl Gone Mad, my first Avery Bishop novel, of the location that occurs actually they occur in both. So kind
Hmm.
of like have brought those two things together in one large universe.
So you kind of like
Oh, and
drop.
then just to answer your question, and then of course there's just crazy, twists and when whatever else as we kind of like learn things throughout the paths, and we're bouncing back and forth through what
Hmm.
happens with the girls the day they get abducted up until the night of the escape when Megan manages to escape, and then of course the present day as she's kind of going through her own personal drama and everything else.
Yeah, personally, a dual timeline is one of my favorite ways to read a book, especially if it's done really well, like your books are, because you get the present and then you get, just a little hint of the past, which helps explain the present just a little bit more. And that's honestly my favorite way to read is a dual timeline. So um, and then the Easter egg thing, I know a lot of people love Easter eggs. And so if they read all of your books, you're saying they'll find characters and scenes that go from one book to another.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. There are some characters, and then sometimes it's even like just very things that most even readers who have read all the books might not even catch. Might like it might be a location or it might be a complete little reference to something that in my head I think like, oh, you know what? These could be, these characters or these side characters from this book. And again, it's one of those things there's just, once you create a world inside a novel, um, like none of these books are a series. In fact, I think I had seen someone said like, "Oh, this was almost like a series because it includes characters from other books." And it's like, well, that's not really kind of what's going on here. It's more of just a shared universe where it's just like everything is happening, everything all at once, just like the movie.
Do you think you would ever write a series?
Under Avery Bishop.
Or Robert?
Well, yeah, I mean, under Robert Sword, I do have my Killing Room series. I do have my
Okay.
Holly
Yep.
Lynn series. I have the Man of Wax books. There's four, well, it's a trilogy with a prequel, so technically it's four. And I definitely have ideas for potential future series under that under the Robert Swarwood brand. In terms of Avery Bishop, because this was actually a conversation I had with my editor at Audible because they said that they would like to, potentially try to like, do some type of series. And I said, I don't see really Avery Bishop. doing a series. Those are more just standalones.
Okay.
Under my real name, sure, that's not a problem. I could see, certainly doing a series. I just feel like at this point, I just don't really know. I just don't know how because these are such like psychological suspense thrillers. They don't really kind of lend themselves to more of a, like again, I'm not opposed to it. I just don't know how. I just don't know.
Yeah, and that's true. A lot of thrillers are standalones, as because you pretty much want to have your event happen and then have it either wrap up or leave it on a cliffhanger, but then leave it on that cliffhanger and not complete it with another book. So let's talk about why you write under the two different names and what are the differences, because you've talked about, under Robert you would do this, under Avery you would do this. So tell us a little bit about that.
So I don't remember exactly how long it was, but one year I had asked to be on a panel at some Writers Digest conference up in New York City when they were still having them up in New York City. I don't think they have them in the city anymore. But and it was really nice. Like they paid for my travel and hotel just to come up to
Nice.
be on one panel. In fact, I think I was on a panel with Grady Hendrix, and this was before Grady like really blew up.
Mm-hmm.
And the night I had gone in, I had met with a friend of mine. It's a guy I know for a very long time, just through like the horror field. He works at Random House. He still works at Random House in like I think digital marketing, like really high up in like PR
Mm-hmm.
stuff. And we met at a bar. We're just like talking, having dinner, whatever. And we were talking about writing and everything else. And I forget how it came up, but at some point I had said, because I think we were talking about just like the different books that were being published. And I think this was around the time, maybe, of course, like Gone Girl and a lot. There were always this
Mm-hmm.
quote unquote girl books. And I had said, like, the girl with the dragon tattoo, Gone Girl, the girl on the train. I remember like saying to him almost jokingly one night, he's like, I think I should write a book with a girl in the title. At which point he looked at me almost very seriously and said, "You should." And I was like, "Okay." I was like, "He clearly knows what he's talking about. I mean, he's really high up, working on like marketing and stuff, and so he sees the data or whatever else."
Mm-hmm.
So
Yep.
around that time, I had come up with this title, and usually when I come up with books, it's more of maybe an initial idea or a character, and things kind of grow from there. In this instance, I came up with a title first. I came up with the title "Girl Gone Mad." I had no idea what the story was going to be. I just knew like, okay, Girl Gone Mad. I don't think this title has ever been used before. This could, and it has a nice little, Girl Gone Mad. It has a nice sound to it, and
Mm-hmm.
I just kind of kept that in my back pocket. And one of the designers, because a lot of my earlier stuff that had gone through a lot of different agents, shopping around, just never really being able to sell anything. I'd done a lot of self-publishing. Actually, I think this was back again. This was a long time ago. It feels like, I knew Joe Conrad and Blake Crouch, and they had encouraged me at that point, because like there was what I would call a Kindle gold rush, which I have this conspiracy theory, which I'm pretty sure is accurate, that around a certain time, Amazon was kind of tweaking the algorithms for self-published writers because they were trying to get bigger name authors to come and start publishing with them. So you would see a
Mm-hmm.
lot of these authors who were having great success self-publishing and making, selling a lot of books, making a lot of money when you could just upload a novel and then just within a month sell thousand copies by doing nothing. Those days are long gone. It is no longer easy like that. But around that time, I had a lot of these books that just, we had shopped around through previous agents and I just had them. And, it felt like they hadn't been rejected because they were bad books necessarily, just like, they just weren't right. Because
Mm-hmm.
usually when you're sending out a book, you're dealing with just a handful of editors who just at a glance they'll say like, oh, whether or not they like it or not, or they like it, they take it to their acquisitions or marketing, and then sometimes a book that an editor wants off like might just get rejected for whatever reason, so or it's too similar to something else. So there's just a
Mm-hmm.
variety of reasons that a book could get rejected. And so anyway, I had put up a lot of those unpublished manuscripts as self-published ebooks, which and then they started taking off. My biggest one was The Serial Killer's Wife under my name. That was my first book that hit the USA Today bestseller list. And there were designers that I had worked with, and there was one designer in particular who, at that point, at that time, had kind of a quote unquote pre-made section of their website where there were these pre-made covers, I guess covers that they had made for other clients, and they just
Okay.
they weren't used because oftentimes with these designers, they'll usually send you like like more than one
Mm-hmm.
potential cover. They'll send you like two or three, and in some cases maybe four or five, and then you kind of pick one, and from there you kind of go and like tweak those and until it's ready. And there was this cover that really stuck out. It was very a Megan Abbott-esque type cover of this uh, maybe like a girl in high school, but you don't really see her face, but you kind of like see her chin, and she's like, you tell like she's kind of in school, and it was like
Mm-hmm.
the way it was set up was the like a title goes here, and I was like, oh, Girl Gone Mad. And so I actually have it somewhere when I ended up like spying because I was like, oh, this could really work, and it actually has my real name on it, Girl Gone Mad. And then from that, I was like, okay, well, I don't really see this book being like a YA novel. And then just thinking about it, I was like, well, what if it's a book that like, is about these girls in high school and then, and then really the story, it was so ass backwards in terms of how it came about because like it started with the title and then from that the story grew.
Mm-hmm.
And my initial first couple drafts, what I ended up at that point, because I had long ago had parted ways with my agent at the time, and so I was looking for a new agent. Um, and at that point too, I knew at a certain point that it would probably best not to publish under my name because this was very female centric story. There were a lot of other authors out there, J.P. Delaney, Riley Sager,
Mm-hmm.
um, I think even A.J. Finn at that time. Like a lot of these like men writing more female centric stories. Like of course, I had written like The Serial Killer's Wife under my name, but
Mm-hmm.
that was a completely different novel. This was starting to veer into the psychological suspense thriller category, and I just instinctively I knew like I don't think this book would do well under my name. Because at a glance, because again, and I've had arguments, well, I don't want to say arguments, but I've had discussions in the past where I would say like I don't know if Gone Girl would have been a big book if the author of Gone Girl was like, John Thompson. I just kind of feel like for whatever reason, there's just, it's because Gillian Flynn is just like, there's just the
Mm-hmm.
perfect, byline on there. Because I feel like you mentioned with the cover, I feel like, I don't know, like maybe it's something subconscious for some readers where, yes, a cover draws their eye and the title, but I also sometimes feel like maybe also the author and they see like a certain type of novel and then they see maybe a certain man's name or even a female's name on like a type of book that like a Jack Carr would publish, and you're like, I'm
Mm-hmm.
not really sure about that. So, so basically at that point, I had started reaching out to other agents, and this was a very different draft from the one that got published. It was very much quote unquote Robert Swartwood because it had kind of a very similar starting point from where it did now, which but kind of very similar to like The Girls in the Dark. We have kind of again, there's flashbacks and the present day story, but the flashbacks was
Mm-hmm.
these girls in high school. This new girl comes to school, and these popular girls basically befriend her and then just terrorize her to the point where she, tries to commit suicide. And then I think
Mm-hmm.
15 years later, the main character, she starts working as a therapist. She's always felt guilt over what happened. And then she finds out that her old friend group, because they had all parted ways, one of them had died by suicide. And then they found another one died by suicide. And this whole idea, like, is this girl basically, what happened to this girl? Like,
Mm-hmm.
is she back for revenge and whatever else?
Yep.
And one of these agents, I had taken a big swing. I don't want to say, I guess, who it was, but I had submitted to an agent for a very big, well-known author. And one of the people that worked for her, and actually worked for for the literary agency, had requested the full manuscript, and she said she loved it, and she passed it on to the agent who ended up passing. But then she came to me and said, would you be willing to work with me on this book? Because again, at the time, I wasn't really, I mean, I was reading some psychological suspense and thrillers, but again, the types of books I was writing were just the more like Harlan Coben, David Baldacci, very just like,
Mhm.
very
Action.
fast-paced thriller
Yep.
action, very over the top in many ways. And of course, these books are, much more subtle. They're
Hmm.
not so like and then so I started having conversations with these people at the agencies, and then there was this agent's also assistant started kind of helping. We were doing like phone calls, we started working, and then I realized, and like it was this incredible experience of basically realizing this is the type of book that I wanted to write. That wasn't the book I wrote, but they helped me write the type of book that I wanted to write, and kind of like because like there was some over the top stuff happening in the third act, and really kind of pulling back on a lot of these things, making it a little bit moodier. And what's kind of funny is they spent all this time, and ultimately, then they didn't really have anybody at the agency who was interested in that novel. So I ended up taking it elsewhere, and then it's signing with a different agent, and then it went to auction. Amazon Publishing ended up publishing it. It came out in, I think, was it August 2020? And of course, like the height of COVID.
Hmm.
Um, and but from there I just started really learning just more of kind of like the difference between a Robert Swartwood novel, which was much more very like out of the gate, fast paced, very just again you could say over the top at times, like very much action, very like Reacher-esque type novel,
Yep.
as opposed to the Avery Bishop books, which are again, I'm trying to go along with those, Gillian Flynn type, books, which were like much more focused on character, a little quieter. In fact, I think my editor at Amazon had really, and I had written it down somewhere. I'm probably going to butcher this, but she had said something like a thriller is more where you see the violence on the page as opposed to suspense, where it's more of just the threat of that violence. And so that was something that
Yeah.
always so like for a couple of years I just kind of feel like a lot of with my Avery Bishop books I'm still trying to kind of pull back at times where just like part of my Robert Swartwood wants to really start pushing things and kind of going. And in fact, even in The Girls in the Dark, there are some action sequences which are, more, I think, more Robert Swartwood, but I felt like really fit well in the book. Um, where as opposed to and at the same time I feel like even with my Robert Swartwood novels they're very very fast paced. I don't know, like I don't like consciously sit down and say like okay this is going to happen, this is going to happen, this is going to happen. It just happens that way. And so with The Girls in the Dark it might not be a balls to the wall thriller, but at the same
Hmm.
time I feel like it's very fast paced. It's a thing that just you're just constantly just like ideally just turning the page. So I write the suspense thrillers in a very Robert Swartwood thriller way, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
Probably doesn't.
No, it does because the very first pages of this book with the sister running out and running into the people who find her, and then the little bit of the sister has, um I forget how you wrote it, but the sister is kind of like maybe wondering if the couple is really trying to help her or if they're trying to, trick her somehow. And that's just very, very subtle because it's only about 2, 3 pages long. But it's a great way to start the book. From there, I was hooked from there. So so let's talk a little bit more about The Girls in the Dark. So what inspired this book?
Th- This was a book, I feel like some ideas, sometimes if I am pitching things to or having conversations with my agent to figure out like new ideas to work on or an editor. Um, some ideas are kind of newer than others or fresher than others, where I can really pinpoint, oh, I maybe saw this headline somewhere and it kind of got me thinking. And then there are some ideas, and I never typically like to write down ideas because I feel like the ones that really stick with me after a decade or two or even longer, and I still haven't had a chance to write them yet, are the ones that are worth writing. As opposed to, I might have this idea and then next week I completely forget about it. It's because, clearly there was just something about it that wasn't worth doing.
Hmm.
Sometimes, and you see this a lot with a lot of books nowadays. You'll see it, there's always these comps like, oh, this is, we mentioned Gone Girl. This is, Gone Girl meets the Girl on the Train.
Hmm.
What that means, who knows? But it's always this thing that publishers try to, they want to like get these popular books to like, get people to be like, oh, I liked this book, so maybe I'll like this book. And so
Yep.
I had seen this book. And then sometimes you'll see kind of a combination of so and so meets so and so, and just at least for me, like my writer brain just immediately just is like, oh, that's interesting, and just starts thinking like, oh, where would I go with that? And so I'd seen this book at one point, I think pitched as like Sharp Objects meets Room, and again, immediately it stuck with me, and my mind
Hmm.
started kind of saying like, "Whoa, where would I go with something like that?" And where I went with that was completely different from the book that you know that I saw it pitched as, or that the publisher had put out. In fact, I even looked it up recently to see if they still had that language somewhere in the on the Amazon
Hmm.
product description, and it's not there
Yep.
anymore. So maybe I just made it up. I have no idea. But I remember that like that was something I was like, okay, well that's interesting. Sharp objects meets room. Like what can you do with that? And then it just sometimes was just kind of just it just kind of simmers in the back of your head, and you're just kind of like thinking like, oh, and like oh, like where you could take it from. And very much like with Girl Gone Mad, I initially had this idea years and years ago, and I think this was actually going to be the kind of the third option book that we had pitched to Amazon Publishing. And it was very different. It had a very similar setup, but initially I kind of foreseen it going in a completely different, kind of crazier, over the top way. And again, that just didn't really work out. I kind of set it aside. And at that time too, I we started working on other stuff because I felt like the first two Avery Bishop novels had dealt with these, there's the main female character in present day, and flashbacks to when she was younger, very similar to the Girls in
Hmm.
the Dark. And I even said to my agent, like, I don't really want the Avery Bishop brand to become necessarily these types of books. Not that I'm necessarily against it, but I don't want to think because I feel like there are some writers who do really well where every book they come out is the same, but it's different. Like,
Hmm.
we mentioned Riley Sager. I feel like he does a really great job in that, his next book is nothing like his previous book, but it's still a thriller. It's still dealing
Hmm.
with whatever else. Whereas opposed to, I don't want to specifically put anybody under the bus, but like certain, writers, you line them up, you line 10 of them up, and they're essentially the same, the same story, the same type of
Hmm.
set. So I was like, so we ended up kind of doing something completely different with that. And but anyway, kind of, after a while, it was a story that really stuck with me. I was a story that I was like, I feel like, and at that point, sometimes I feel like certain books maybe at the time they're not ready to be written, and maybe that's just my I don't think I have ever have writer's block, but there are times where I just am like I just don't feel like the time I like with my Robert Sword novel The Killing Room. At the time I had actually started writing a different standalone novel, and again this was after around I think the pandemic. And part of me kind of felt I needed to necessarily, I don't say address the pandemic, but like this was a book where the pandemic had taken place. And
Hmm.
I'm writing it, and it was just, I don't know, I just wasn't feeling it. And so I had ended up pitching my agent. I was like, maybe we should truly, here's another idea. And she really liked that one. And then that one became The Killing Room. And, but I had recently have been going back to that old idea because I just feel like I'm in a better place where I really know what I want to do with that story, how the story is going to be best served, and ultimately how the reader will be best served.
That's a really interesting perspective on it. The fact that you have books and then you're like, oh, it's not really the right time for me to write it, and you kind of come back to it. So your mind just must be full of ideas. And how
Oh
how
yeah.
do you how do you pick the one at that time? Is maybe just a gut feeling or something like that?
So, unfortunately, now I feel like I am at least as close as I'm ever going to be to a proper adult. So I have, I have bills, I have a mortgage. So I no longer have the luxury of just doing whatever I want to do. Like after college, I was still living at home. I was working in a movie theater at night. I was subbing during the day, and I had come up with this. At that point, I forget how many books I had written, but I had come up with this idea, and it's what became my novel Man of Wax. And I wrote that first draft, 90,000 words in 3 weeks. Because I was taking my laptop I was working at the movie theater. I was working up in the booth, in the projection
Hmm.
booth. So like between sets, I would just like, knock out a chapter. I was writing, I guess 3 weeks, probably like was it 4,000 words? At least 4,000. I mean, I was writing so much, there were days where they would call me to come in and sub, and I would say like, I'm not really feeling well today, just because I wanted to just write all day. I don't really have that luxury. And again, at that time too, I had no plans. I just knew my opening, whereas basically this guy, family man, he lives in Pennsylvania. He wakes up in this motel room in California, has no idea how he got there, no idea where his family is. He wakes up, he finds a message in blood on the bathroom door, says, "Let the game begin." That was the first chapter. And I had no idea where it was going to go. Like I just sat down and just started writing. Now, I feel again, time is I don't have that luxury of time where I can just really just sit down and just kind of like play things because I have like I have certain commitments of either contracts or I have other things we need to work on, especially now
Hmm.
juggling two different names. I have books under my name, Robert Swarwood. I have books under the Avery Bishop brand. And again, there are different types of books, and there are even times where like I might have a conversation with my agent, and she might said like, "So is this more of an Avery Bishop book?" And I'm like, I think it's more of a Robert Swartwood novel because X, Y, and Z. And I
Hmm.
had even jokingly said to her, I said, maybe some books might just be like a Robert Swartwood and Avery Bishop novel, kind of like, we're like co-writers because it kind
Yep.
of like, we're kind of because essentially they're all thrillers, but they're different types of thrillers.
Yeah. Yeah. One's more, like you said, action. The other's more suspense. Um, yeah. And I'm just amazed that one person can write like that. So yeah, I'm really impressed by that. So in The Girls in the Dark, it's you said it's about a set of twins. Why did you choose twins versus sisters or cousins or friends or any other relation?
Yeah, I, a lot of these books are usually at least, again, a lot of these setups in the psychological suspense space, I kind of feel like it's very oversaturated, where it's difficult oftentimes to just come up with something that's new. And so
Hmm.
usually what I like to do is kind of play off maybe like popular ideas and kind of put my own spin on things or whatever else. Like that's what I've done with a few different novels in the past. And so the books where oftentimes people have been abducted are usually like friends or whatever else, or I think maybe even sisters, but I've never really seen any ones with necessarily twins. I thought that was, excuse me, kind of like a little bit interesting, a little bit different in terms of maybe
Hmm.
like this idea of a serial killer who specifically is targeting, you know, twins. Because we find out that they are not the first ones who have been abducted. I think there had been either 3 or 4 sets of twins prior to them being abducted.
Yeah, and that is true. Thinking about the thrillers that I've read, it's usually friends, cousins maybe, but yeah, not a lot of twins. So yeah, that's a good point.
Plus, it was also something to play around with in terms of the characters, where, and especially with sisters, I mean, even if they're like a couple, well, I wouldn't say a couple months apart, but at least like, at least 9 months apart in
Hmm.
terms of the interesting thing about having the idea of twins is, when you're twins, and again, I'm an only child, I would have no idea, but from what I could, speculate and from what I could tell, starting out at least as as young children, there's this identity where you were very much like like people see you together, they don't see you as individuals. And so especially with these girls then getting into high school, one really starts breaking away, kind of wants to have her own personality and whatever else, and that
Hmm.
creates tension between them. And honestly, I don't think it's really a spoiler alert because it happens pretty early in the book. The day they get abducted is because they're having a fight. And so, they end up somewhere, they're kind of like really angry at each other, and then that's when they get abducted. And then so that becomes a whole, then they're in this completely different, basically they're locked away in separate cages, but they're in the same room,
Hmm.
and it's just like, yeah, it creates this more, I think, tension that had they just been friends or had they just been, sisters with, because the same idea, like, with sisters, they would probably be in different grades. They would, whereas opposed to here, they have had the same teachers throughout the years. They've had, they're in the
Hmm.
same grade. They have the same friend group. Although again, one starts kind of like pulling away and starting getting her own, friend group. So for me, that dynamic was a little bit more interesting to play with.
So, like I said, this book comes out very shortly. What kind of things do you have plans for the publication? Are you going on tour? Are you doing interviews? What kind of stuff do you have planned?
Yeah, there's not really much, quite honestly. I mean, this is coming out from Book of Tour. They're much more digital publisher, so it's not like, a few of their books get repackaged, at least in the United States, through like Grand Central, but that's not happening at least anytime soon. So it's not going to really be in bookstores. It's more available as like an ebook, as a print-on-demand paperback, and as an audiobook. Brittany Presley actually is the narrator. I had to really push and pull some strings behind the scenes to make that happen because she has done one of my other books before. I know her. She's fantastic, and she did a great job with the audiobook. You guys were very kind to ask me to come on here, so thank you. And I think I have like another podcast interview. I think the morning of our local, ABC affiliate has like a morning show. They're always kind enough to have local authors come in and kind of like talk about the books, but. I think that's really about it, quite honestly. And I have a few next Saturday. Well, I don't know when this is going to be aired, but on the 25th of April, there's going to be like a library thing with a bunch of different authors I'll be part of in Ephrata, Pennsylvania, at the Ephrata
Hmm.
Public Library. And then the following weekend, Mechanicsburg Mystery Bookshop is going to have I think their third annual Ice Creams for Mysteries type event, which I'm going to be there with a lot of other authors. So no like specific single author event, but I will be, doing things. But
Hmm.
really, then it's always on to the next book. It's always just kind of juggling different projects, and just, really just, yeah, yeah. Who knows what's going to happen?
So, how do you celebrate Pub Day then, since you don't have necessarily a big event to go through or anything like that? You still got to celebrate because you just published a book.
You would think, I guess. I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm at that point now where I've published now probably over 20 books. Yeah, like I couldn't even tell you. I would have to sit down and look how many books I've published. Like and yes, it's always neat, I guess, but at the same time, it's become, I don't know. It's just become another thing. It's just like, okay, it's out there. Let's keep going. Like it's hard
Hmm.
to, you really, I mean, God bless some authors who, might have like a book come out every couple of years and then they're on tour for, like I think I saw, because I live in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And so Chris Whitaker had come up for All the Colors in the Dark on
Hmm.
tour. I think at that point was for the paperback. I mean, and he had talked about how
Yes.
like he had been in like basically a worldwide tour for months, going from
Hmm.
country to country touring. I mean, it's an amazing book. I mean, of course, though, but like, that's just got to be like, I mean, especially as a writer, like, especially if you're a writer, like, like I would say I'm a very, pulpy hack writer where like I'm just writing new books. Like, like I can't imagine just being on the road, managing to try to like, write like, so that's why some of these authors are publishing like maybe like a book every 2 or 3 years because a lot of their schedule is a lot of these events and just it's
Hmm.
very difficult to have that focus when you're on the road as opposed to I mean some manage to do it, but yeah, I mean I'm at a place where it's like it's coming out great, on to the next one, but it's nothing like I don't know, I guess that's kind of sad. Thank you, you're making me sad, Jerry.
Then you have to promise me that on this pub day, you are going to do something special. Order a special meal, whatever it is. Buy
All
yourself
right.
a book, whatever you like. You gotta celebrate somehow.
All right, we'll do.
And I saw Chris on that same tour that you did, the paperback tour for. All the Colors of the Dark. I saw him in Des Moines, Iowa.
Yeah, he was fascinating, and very. I'm trying to remember who was at my event that kind of was talking with him, but I don't know. Like, did he talk about the story about how he was a traitor? You know, like he was online, I guess, traitor or whatever, and then he kind
Yes.
of was supposed to. They wanted to throw him in jail or something.
Yes,
That was a great
yes.
story. But yeah, no, I mean that's such a great book. And it was very fascinating too, hearing about him talk about that novel when you talk about like writers who really kind of like sit down and like will like outline, bit by bit of what the story will be, as opposed
Hmm.
to him where he talked about like he had written so many more words just trying to figure out what is this story about than what it
Yep.
became. Because it's a very long book, but I feel like, it has those really, really short chapters, which really benefits from it.
Hmm.
And that was actually a funny thing too. I mean, I've seen a lot of people with The Girls in the Dark talk about how like, oh, there's a lot of short chapters which help. And yeah, I mean, there are a lot of chapters, but I think like when I think of short chapters, I think of like James Patterson length because I know like because I know a lot of writers who have written with James Patterson, and I think like they try to make sure that the chapters are no more than like I think like 1,300 words, like
Hmm.
no more than 1,300 words. So like that's what like at least like 2 or 3 pages. Like to me, those are
Hmm.
the short chapters. Whereas opposed to, I think some of these chapters might be like 8, 10 pages long, which I guess might be considered short because sometimes you'll open up a book and you'll see like, oh, chapter one is like 40 pages long, and it just is this. I don't know about you, but it's one of those things where I'm like, oh, which is funny because I feel like it's a psychological thing where I don't know, like, because you read a lot, like, do you try to see like, okay, I'm opening a book, how long is chapter one? Or I finish this chapter, how long is the next chapter? It's like, oh, this next chapter is 30 pages. I don't have time for that right now. But you're like, had it been, oh, this next chapter is only 4 pages. Okay. And then this next chapter is only 5 pages. Okay. And then before you
Keep
realize it,
going.
you read 50 pages
Hmm.
when had it been a 30-page chapter, you would have felt like, I don't have time for that. So I think it's like this weird psychological thing that it's always in the back of my head. I always try to make sure that, yeah, I don't want to have a two, and if it is a long chapter, it's for a reason.
Hmm. Yeah, I completely agree with that because I don't think of chapters when I pick up a book, but when I go to read it and it's like, okay, I have 5 minutes before I got to run out the door. Can I finish the next chapter, or can I get to the next, scene break? Because sometimes chapters have, those little like breaks in them.
Yeah.
Can I get to somewhere that when I pick it back up, I don't have to figure out where on the page I am. I know because it's either a new chapter or after a page break or something like that. So yeah, there is something to that, having short chapters, and then because yeah, then you just kind of keep going, and all of a sudden you've read more than you would have if you just would have read the long chapter. But
Yeah, and,
it's.
and I think with the Chris Whitaker novel, I mean, it really benefits from those short chapters. I mean, it's like over 500 pages, and I feel
Mhm.
like you can really just breeze through that novel. Whereas opposed to, you know, had each chapter been 20, 30 pages long, it would not have been, and I don't think it would have been as successful, quite honestly, as it has been. But let me ask you something real quick. So you obviously read a lot of books, and you mentioned
Mhm.
before about listening to audiobooks. Do you listen to the like when you listen to an audiobook, like what speed do you listen to it on?
I am. I still consider myself a baby audiobook reader, because I listen to audiobooks, but I can only listen to them in my car. I
Hmm.
can't listen to them if I'm at home doing, things around the house or at work doing things at work because it becomes background noise for me and I quickly lose whatever I'm listening to. And then all of a sudden I realize I have no idea what happened in these last two chapters.
Yeah,
But if I'm in my car, I can listen to an audiobook for hours and it's 100% fine. Now, that I don't mind stopping wherever I need to stop, whether it's in the middle of a chapter or whatever. And I think it's because I can just hit play and it'll start exactly where I'm at. Whereas if I have a physical book, I have to open the page or even an ebook somewhere on that screen is where I have to start again and I have to know where that is. Whereas an audiobook, I just hit play and it just keeps going. But so the speed I listen to is typically 1.25, which I know is really, really slow for a lot of people. Um, I did just listen to one though at 1.75. But I think it's more of the way the narrator talks because I don't like him to sound like a chipmunk to be
Yeah.
going so fast. I like to be able to consume the book and understand it and really enjoy it and not just listen to blah 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 kind of kind of going on. So usually the 1.25 is usually where I'm at.
And so when you're reading a novel, like how many books would you say you read like in a week or like a month? Do you usually have a certain number that you try to knock out? Because I imagine you and a lot of bookstagrammers such as yourself probably get bombarded with books, and so you probably don't have time to really sit down. And I mean, I'm assuming like yeah, like how does that work? Like, are you kind of I don't want to say speed reading, but I mean, like, are you really reading everything? Or I mean, or I guess maybe certain books. I mean, like for me personally, sometimes the writing is just immediately pulls me in, and like I am reading every single word. And
Hmm.
other books, I might do that for a chapter or two, and then realize I'm just going to start kind of, you know, scanning the page, and
Yeah,
because it's like, yeah,
I think it depends on the format I'm reading. And I actually recently I've had a Kindle Fire for the longest time, which has I have the 7-inch screen, or no, the 11-inch screen. So it's huge. And so I have like a huge page in front of me or multiple pages, however many fit on the screen. And I found when I got an actual Kindle and the screen was smaller, I found myself reading slower.
hmm,
And when I thought about it, I think it's because when I read on my Kindle Fire, I do unknowingly skim
hmm,
or read a little faster and maybe not read every word, but enough that, my brain puts it together.
yeah,
Whereas on the Kindle, it's a shorter screen and I have to have the font a little bit bigger. So then I can't consume as much before I have to swipe and go to the next page again. So it's
yeah,
something I've been thinking about since I got my Kindle about probably a month or two ago. Um, and I really think I read slower with it. And it's
hmm,
because I can't, you know, I can't unknowingly skim as much because I have to turn the page. So
right.
I, I don't know. I'm still kind of thinking about that. But when it comes to reading like the books, it really depends on kind of the genre too. Because if it's historical fiction, I'm going to focus more on that. Whereas if it's like, considered like a popcorn thriller, those I can read in probably 3 hours, maybe. Um, and it's because they're typically short, 300 pages or less. And I can just go through them so fast.
Yeah.
But like I said, I don't knowingly skim, I'll say, but I think I do.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think at least for me as a writer, I have really come to appreciate what we call white space. So instead of just like blocks of text on a screen on a screen, because I imagine I don't know about you, like especially if you open a book like chapter one and it's just the entire chapter is just like one long paragraph. I think something kind of shrivels
Hmm.
inside of you and dies.
Yes.
Whereas opposed to, that white space where it's like a lot of, and again, I think it kind of helps where not necessarily you might start skim reading, but it almost feels that way because you're going so fast because it's the way it's structured. So that is something that I've become very conscious of writing, especially I guess more of my Robert Swartman novels, but also the Avery Bishop books, where I really, try to avoid large chunks of text because I feel that oftentimes especially in today's modern age, people's attentions just quickly drift. And so if they
Hmm.
get stuck in a long paragraph, again, they're probably either going to end up skipping down, going down or whatever else, or just kind of, you might lose because again, going back to the idea of like a writer's biggest enemy is obscurity. I think the other thing is also just that, keeping people's attention. Like when you are reading it,
Yep.
just really kind of keeping them focused on the page and the story.
Yeah, and I would definitely agree with that. If I mainly on a Kindle, I'd say rather than a physical book. But if I'm on a Kindle or Kindle Fire and it's just this block of text, I'm like, oh my gosh, can I actually keep up and know which line I'm on? Because I may be, um, you know, watching my kid's soccer game at the same time, so my attention's not fully on the book. And yeah, having that like break, kind of like I was talking about earlier with the page break, is really helpful because then I know, one, I know where I'm at, and
Yeah.
then two, it's just a lot easier to read because the same as we were talking about earlier, I maybe have time to read, another short chapter, whereas I don't have a time to read 30 pages. I may have time to read another short paragraph, but not a whole page of text. So the same thing for me kind of applies.
Then let me ask you real quick though, what have you found? Like, are there pet peeves that you have? Because usually when I chat with like narrators, I always ask them like, "What are your pet peeves as a narrator?" I never
Mhm.
really have talked to specifically like, at least in a setting like this, like a bookstagrammer like yourself. So like when you're
Mhm.
reading books, are there certain things that stick out to you where you just find yourself kind of inwardly maybe groaning? Or you might be, or like, because again, I'm sure you get bombarded with books like, and you mentioned before, like obviously covers are helpful and everything
Mhm.
else, like how you might decide to read one book over another. But are there certain things that when you're reading, you're just like, that you love versus like, oh my God, I can't believe we're doing this.
I love a character driven novel. And I love plot driven too, but I love ones that can pull me in and I can see myself in the book. Characters are right next to me doing their thing, but I am in the book. So really that world building and making me feel like I'm inside the book is really what hooks me. And then if it's a series, if I get connected to a character and I just love them, I'm going to want to read every single book that they're in because I want to see, how they change and develop and how their life goes. And there's a couple police procedural series like that go on for quite a few books, and they can definitely be read as standalones, but then also not having that continuation of the character is also a big part of the book too. So um I don't know if I answered your
Yeah.
question very good,
Yeah.
but
No,
it's
yeah. No, there's no right or wrong answer.
but yeah, it's more of I'd say some of my peeves or maybe like some tropes like miscommunication like kind of drives me nuts. Is like if you people would just talk, then
Mm.
then the story would be so much better. But yeah, I say I don't really have any pet peeves when it comes to writing styles. I like a lot of different writing styles, but it's really where I'm pulled in and I look up and realize that I'm in my living room. I'm wherever I am and not actually in wherever the book is set. That
Mm.
really draws me in. If you could maybe tell us, if people are looking for signed copies of your books, are there certain bookstores they can go to find them, or where's the best place for them to find your books in general?
A lot of them are just going to be, I guess, online
Okay.
retailers. Signed books. I mean, I guess if you went to my website and requested something, we could make something happen. But nothing. There's nothing. I mean, specifically, like in the past, I had kind of partnered up with my local independent bookstore to do like signed pre-orders. But because this book is such like kind of like a print-on-demand type thing, it just didn't really feel worth doing this time, to be completely
Hmm.
honest with you. But because again, it's always important to, support your indies. But
Yep.
yeah, I mean, if people wanted, specifically a signed copy, usually, shoot me an email, either website, my, robertswartwood.com or averybishopbooks.com. And usually, yeah, we can make something happen.
Okay. Sounds good. Because if people like me, a book is great, a signed book is even better, and then a personalized signed book is like the top.
Oh, I got one that's coming to you. Like I said, I have the list of you that Tanya had sent me. So yeah,
Perfect.
absolutely.
Perfect. I'll be watching my mail for it.
Well, thank you so much for making time.